They laughed when she rolled up her sleeve and revealed the tattoo, a faded, intricate medical insignia inked across her forearm. To the mechanics, it was just another wannabe symbol from someone trying too hard to look tough in a man's world. But they stopped laughing the moment a Navy SEAL team walked into the hangar and fell dead silent. One by one, hardened warriors dropped their tools, eyes locked on the tattoo, not out of ridicule, but reverence. She wasn't just a mechanic. She was someone they had mourned, someone they believed had died in the chaos of war, and someone who had saved each of their lives when hope had run dry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The heat in the maintenance bay was thick, with the smell of hydraulic fluid and scorched metal. Sparks flew from grinders, oil stained the concrete in broad strokes, and the air vibrated with the bassy hum of hangar equipment echoing through steel walls. At the far end of Bay 4, a woman worked alone under the belly of a battered MH-60 helicopter. Her jumpsuit was 2 sizes too large, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, her boots scuffed and blackened from months of hard labor. Grease lined her jaw like war paint, and the shoulder patch on her uniform read Rios. She was new to this base, dropped in a month ago after a transfer request processed through channels no one really questioned. From the moment she arrived, whispers followed her. Mechanics, mostly men, passed her with skeptical glances. Some were indifferent, others amused. A few openly laughed when she hoisted a transmission component twice her weight without flinching. But none asked about the tattoo on her arm. They noticed it, sure. The stylized snake wrapped around a combat scalpel, an unusual emblem that looked military but didn't match any known unit. One junior tech joked that maybe she got it off a cereal box, and the others had a good laugh. She didn't react. Not once. Rios kept her head down and her hands busy. She worked twice as fast as the others, and while her name had barely registered during morning roll call, her results spoke loud. Helicopters signed off by her, ran smoother, performed cleaner, and required less post-flight attention. The veterans on base, though, remained unimpressed. They'd seen hotshots come and go, young talent with something to prove, eager to flash credentials and bark orders. But Rios didn't talk. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't ask for favors or defend her place on the floor. She was just there. The odd thing was, no one could place her. She had no social media presence, no background stories to share. One guy swore he recognized her from a naval medical unit out of Germany, but the files didn't match. Another claimed she was former Army, but her ID checked out as Navy logistics. Whatever she'd done before showing up here was sealed up tighter than an armory vault. The higher-ups didn't say a word either. The commanding officer nodded approvingly when her reports came in, but otherwise, she was a ghost in coveralls. Outside the hangar, the base itself was tense. For weeks, brass had circulated rumors of an upcoming classified operation. Spec ops teams were rotating through the airstrip without notice, security doubled, no-fly zones widened. Everyone with clearance could feel the pressure of something heavy bearing down, a mission with stakes higher than usual, but no one knew details. The helicopters under Rios's hands were among those selected for modifications, upgrades far beyond standard maintenance, the kind of upgrades only a few people knew how to implement. She didn't complain about the long hours. When asked to stay late, she stayed. When new schematics were dumped on her desk at midnight, she reviewed them without question. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her answers were clipped and precise. Roger. Understood. I'll handle it. No one ever heard her say she couldn't. One morning, during routine prep, an NC noticed her studying the avionics panel of a Black Hawk with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not curiosity, but calculation. As though she wasn't learning it, she was remembering it. He joked that she was probably planning to steal the bird and fly it to Cuba. She gave a faint smirk and said nothing. But that tattoo, that's what got under people's skin. It wasn't fresh, but old and weathered. It wasn't inked with flash, but with meaning. A few of the older techs guessed it might be from a covert medical team, one of those that patched up operators in the field before medevacs could reach. But no one ever confirmed it. And every time someone asked, Rios either deflected or ignored the question entirely. Then came the morning the SEALs arrived. 4 of them, all in civilian clothes, walked into the hangar unannounced. The air shifted instantly. Conversations died, drills clicked off, and even the hangar's supervisor stepped aside without protest. These weren't just any SEALs. Their faces were worn by battle and hardened by things only a few on base could guess at. They weren't looking for a helicopter. They were looking for someone. And the moment they saw her, crouched under the tail boom with a socket wrench in hand, her tattoo visible under the flicker of shop lights, everything changed. They stopped cold. They didn't speak. They didn't blink. Because standing there, alive and whole, was the woman they had watched bleed out on a mountainside 2 years ago.
And no one else in the hangar had any idea who she really was. Before the Navy SEALs ever set foot in the hangar, Rios had already become the subject of dozens of whispered conversations and behind-the-back smirks. The men she worked alongside, mechanics who had logged years on the job, men who had developed calloused hands and cynical eyes, took one look at her and made their judgment. To them, she was just another attempt by the higher-ups to inject diversity into the workforce, a favored hire with no real grit. Her lean frame and silent demeanor did nothing to convince them otherwise. When she worked quietly, they said she was timid. When she kept to herself, they called her aloof. And when she didn't take part in their crude jokes or shop banter, they accused her of thinking she was better than them. The pattern began subtly. The first week, her assignments were light, changing filters, topping fluids, replacing worn-out bolts, routine work that required little thinking. A test, perhaps. Then, as she completed each task with near-mechanical precision, the leads began assigning her more tedious work, cleaning hydraulic lines, degreasing fan blades, inventorying crates of tools, things normally assigned to the least experienced crew. It didn't matter that she handled each job faster and cleaner than anyone else. No one said a word about the efficiency. They only commented on how quiet she was, how odd it was that she never asked for help, how strange it seemed that someone so green never made a mistake. Things escalated when a new batch of interns arrived. Young, loud, eager to impress. They took one look at Rios and immediately decided she wasn't a threat. One of them, a tall kid named Darnell, who came from a long line of Navy machinists, made a show of calling her Tattoo Barbie in front of the crew. The nickname stuck. Every time she bent over a turbine or reached for a torque wrench, someone muttered it under their breath. Rios ignored them. She didn't flinch, didn't fire back, didn't even look up. The silence only made it worse. The dismissals weren't always verbal. One afternoon, during a briefing on rotor assembly sequencing, she raised her hand to point out a calibration error on a spec sheet. The chief engineer paused, scanned her face, and nodded as if humoring her. When the correction turned out to be right, saving hours of potential rework, he didn't acknowledge her again. The others noticed, and the message was clear. She could be right, but it wouldn't matter. Her place was below notice. When she worked the graveyard shift, parts she needed would go missing. Someone misplaced her torque calibration tool 3 nights in a row. Another time, her bench was cleared and her labeled diagrams tossed in the scrap bin. She said nothing. She simply started over, each time with the same measured pace, the same unshaken focus. It was as though she'd dealt with far worse, and this was just noise. The ones who mocked her the loudest couldn't explain why she always seemed 2 steps ahead. One day, when a tech was struggling to diagnose a vibration issue in a Black Hawk tail rotor, she silently approached, leaned in, and adjusted the blade pitch by a margin of barely 3 degrees. The vibration vanished. The tech blinked, stunned, but before he could say anything, she had already walked away. He never spoke of it. Neither did she. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even the officers weren't immune to the blindness. During a surprise inspection, a lieutenant commander reviewed the maintenance logs and called out a discrepancy, a formatting error that could have delayed flight clearance. The logs belonged to Rios. When questioned, she calmly explained that the template had been changed by Central Command 3 days prior, but the update hadn't been distributed yet. She had caught the change early, adjusted accordingly, and flagged it for approval. The lieutenant didn't apologize. He simply nodded and moved on. No matter what she did, it wasn't enough. Her excellence wasn't loud, and in a world that respected volume over value, she remained overlooked. The more precise her work became, the more it was ignored. The more she endured, the more they assumed she had no spine. They mistook her composure for passivity, her silence for uncertainty. And above all, they mistook her tattoo, that faded medical insignia inked just below her sleeve, for decoration rather than history. No one asked about it with sincerity. They joked, mocked, or speculated, but not once did anyone ask her what it truly meant. The only exception was an old airframe tech named Morales. Grizzled and quiet himself, he watched her work from a distance. He noticed the way she triple-checked critical bolts, how her hands moved with a familiarity that only came from field experience. One day, as she walked past him with a gearbox part clutched to her chest, he squinted at the tattoo and said softly, "That's not for show, is it?" She paused for half a second, gave a slight nod, and kept walking. Morales never said another word about it, but from that day on, he never mocked her, and he never laughed when others did. Outside, the classified operation continued to loom over the base. Whispered briefings and last-minute upgrades were piling up. Special forces units were rotating in and out at strange hours, and aircraft were being fitted with tech that no one talked about openly. And through it all, Rios remained at her bench, wiping grease from her tools and studying each component as if it held the weight of something far greater than machinery.
Her face remained unreadable, her posture calm. But inside, she was watching, not just the aircraft, but the people. She saw how quickly assumptions were made, how authority followed noise, and how invisible truth could be when wrapped in quiet strength. She had been underestimated before, but soon that mistake would cost them. Rios never made a show of what she knew. She moved through the hangar with quiet certainty, her steps deliberate, her eyes sharp. While others joked or smoked or killed time in the tool shed, she studied. She spent breaks poring over wiring diagrams that most of the crew had long since memorized, not because she didn't understand them, but because she wanted to know the variances in each aircraft's build. Every helicopter had a history, and she treated each one like a patient with a case file, noting irregularities others missed or ignored. Her clipboard, always with her, was filled not with standard checklists, but personalized annotations, handwritten charts, and mechanical pulse logs that didn't exist in any official documentation. The signs were always there, if anyone had been looking, but no one was. Or maybe they saw and chose not to acknowledge them because it threatened the version of her they had already decided on. She was just the quiet girl with the tattoo and a misplaced sense of determination. But while they laughed, Rios worked, and while they dismissed her, she noticed the stress fractures in the rotor mast that hadn't been flagged during the last 3 inspections. She saw the telltale residue around the gearbox pressure seal that could have led to a mid-air failure. She caught the misaligned torque values in a digital readout during a routine software update, a mistake so minute that it could only have been made by someone overriding protocols without authorization. She didn't tattle, she fixed it. It wasn't in her nature to grandstand. There was a time for that, but it wasn't here. Not yet. On the base's private server, she occasionally logged into the aircraft diagnostic system. There, tucked deep in the logs, were entries flagged with an anonymous tag, RX-23. These entries corrected system errors, noted calibration drift, or quietly recommended part swaps. Supervisors assumed they were coming from remote diagnostics or AI assist software. In truth, they were Rio's doing, her own silent contribution to safety and efficiency, offered without fanfare or credit. She didn't need them to know. She needed the birds to fly. There were moments, brief flashes, when her instincts surfaced without her meaning them to. One afternoon, a rookie mechanic stripped a bolt on a fuel line assembly. The mistake wasn't catastrophic, but if the aircraft had gone airborne, it could have caused a pressurization failure mid-flight. Rios noticed the mishap from across the bay without being told. She stepped in calmly, asked the kid to take a break, and with a few precise movements, she extracted the damaged bolt, reseated the coupling, and reassembled the line before anyone else had noticed the delay. When the tech lead came over later and asked why the checklist was behind, the kid mumbled something about tools being disorganized. Rios didn't correct him. She only smiled faintly and returned to her own project. More than once, she was seen lingering near the airfield before dawn, long before her shift officially began. She would walk the tarmac slowly, inspecting the parked aircraft, sometimes with a thermal scanner in hand, sometimes with a simple notepad. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing, but to the few who paid attention, Morales among them, it was clear she was taking readings, checking for temperature anomalies that could indicate electrical shorts or fluid leaks. It was a level of proactive care no one had asked for and no one else provided. When pressed on why she was there early, she'd shrug and say she couldn't sleep. Inside the break room, she rarely spoke, but she listened. She absorbed. When someone mentioned that the SEAL team had been on base for only 24 hours, but had already requested a full avionics reconfiguration, she raised her eyebrows slightly and filed that detail away. When another joked that these missions were probably just PR stunts and that the real action happened elsewhere, she didn't react, but her jaw clenched, barely perceptible. She understood things most people around her didn't. She recognized names when others mispronounced them. She knew the purpose of hardware components that others didn't bother to look up. Her silence wasn't ignorance, it was discipline. One of the more telling moments came during a system simulation test. The hangar simulator row ran mock diagnostics on theoretical mid-air failures, allowing crews to practice emergency protocols. It was rare for mechanics to participate, more for pilots and systems engineers. But when one of the techs failed to show up, Rios offered to fill in. The supervisor, too distracted to care, agreed. She sat down at the console, eyes scanning the cascading data, hands poised like a surgeon. When the simulation triggered a triple system failure with staggered feedback loops, a scenario designed to overwhelm even trained pilots, Rios responded in under 12 seconds. She rerouted the flight control signals, manually bypassed the electrical fault, and stabilized the digital interface using keystrokes most of the observers didn't even recognize. When the screen flashed green, the room was quiet. No one clapped, no one spoke. They just reset the simulation and pretended it didn't happen. Afterwards, the lead engineer remarked to his assistant that the girl's lucky guess wouldn't help in the field. Rios, who had already slipped out, never heard it. Or maybe she did, and it just didn't matter. Every day, the hangar operated like a stage with a script written long before she arrived. The others played their roles. The cocky techs, the indifferent supervisors, the veterans who knew better than everyone else.
And Rios, she played the role they gave her, silently correcting their mistakes, quietly improving their performance, and invisibly protecting them from disaster. She wore their disregard like armor, not because she didn't care, but because she had once cared too much and learned what it cost. But the signs were there, undeniable, quietly brilliant, if only someone had looked close enough. And soon, someone would. The tension across the base tightened like a fraying cable under strain. Over the last 72 hours, there had been an undeniable shift in the air,
a quiet urgency that pulsed through the corridors, down into the hangars and out onto the flight line. Aircraft were being prepped at irregular hours. Teams moved in silence, and doors that were once left open during operations were now sealed with armed guards posted at either end. Most personnel weren't told the details, but everyone knew something was coming. Rios could feel it in her bones. Her fingers moved faster through diagnostics. Her notes became more detailed, and her eyes scanned every component like she was expecting them to fail. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours in the last 2 nights, but it didn't show. If anything, she seemed sharper, more locked in. It started with a weather anomaly that shouldn't have mattered. A sudden temperature drop followed by radar interference had disrupted incoming communications from a surveillance drone operating in hostile airspace. That wasn't unusual in itself, but when a second aircraft went dark in the same region and a satellite link showed garbled data from a nearby forward base, things began to unravel. The operation, still unnamed and unconfirmed, was no longer just a strategic insertion, it was a recovery. Something had gone wrong behind enemy lines, and the teams stationed at this airbase were being prepped to respond. By the afternoon of the second day, the base commander convened a private meeting with select flight crew and engineering leads. Rios was not invited. She was in Bay 2, calibrating a flight controller that had been showing inconsistent readings since the last firmware patch. She noticed the convoy of unmarked vehicles pull into the tarmac. She noticed the refueling of burns that weren't on the daily flight schedule. And she noticed that every mechanic in her bay was suddenly pulled into a pre-mission briefing. Everyone except her. Still, she kept working. Inside the conference room, voices were raised. The SEAL team, led by Commander Ash Donovan, demanded accelerated prep on 2 modified Blackhawks and 1 Boast Hawk, outfitted with stealth tech. They were planning to insert into a combat zone ahead of schedule to extract a compromised informant and, if possible, recover a downed operative believed to be alive. There was no time to wait. Flight conditions were unstable, risk was high, and worst of all, the primary medical evacuation support team had been grounded due to a viral outbreak on their transport, something no one had planned for. As flight operations scrambled to assign alternate med support, tensions spilled over. The chief medical officer was already stretched thin. The backup corpsman hadn't trained with the SEALs and didn't know the terrain. The only compatible medic, one who had previously served with Donovan's team, had been declared KIA 2 years ago. The SEALs didn't trust anyone else. They were willing to fly in without proper medical support if necessary, but it was clear they knew what that meant. They would be going in blind, wounded, and potentially without extraction. Back in the hangar, Rios overheard snippets of conversation through open comms. A tech grumbled about last-minute changes, another cursed about a systems override that didn't match the SOP. Rios checked the data on her tablet. The mission parameters had been updated again, but the diagnostics hadn't been properly rerun. The stealth calibration for the Ghost Hawk was 2 cycles behind. If they launched as is, they'd risk detection over hostile airspace. She flagged it, corrected it, and submitted the update. It was quietly approved without attribution. Later that night, a systems failure occurred on one of the Blackhawks, the one Commander Donovan had specifically requested. The tail rotor assembly had been signed off earlier that day, but now the hydraulic system showed erratic pressure drops. A full teardown would take hours. Panic spread through the bay. The lead engineers barked orders, 2 techs scrambled to find replacement parts, and someone blamed the intern for skipping steps. Amid the chaos, Rios stepped in. She didn't ask for permission. She pulled up the maintenance logs, cross-referenced the timestamps, and quickly identified a microfracture in the hydraulic valve that had likely been missed during the initial inspection. Without a word, she located the spare, disassembled the faulty housing, and reassembled the system with such fluid precision that Morales, watching from across the floor, muttered something under his breath about clockwork. When the diagnostics were run again, they came back clean. No one thanked her, no one even acknowledged her. The supervisor claimed it was a group effort and moved on.
But the crisis wasn't over. The mission clock had been accelerated again. The launch window was closing due to shifting weather patterns. If the aircraft weren't ready within 6 hours, the operation would be scrapped. Word filtered through that intelligence on the target's location was degrading. If they didn't extract soon, they might lose the window entirely. A canceled mission meant not just strategic failure, but the probable death of the informant and any trapped personnel. The SEALs were prepared to fly with whoever they had, even if that meant going without a medic at all. At 0400 hours, as the final systems checks were being run, Donovan entered the hangar. He walked with purpose, his team trailing behind him.
The fatigue in his eyes was hidden by force of will, but he looked older than his years. Every step measured like a man walking toward a line he'd already crossed once too often. He scanned the crew, looking for answers, for reassurance, maybe even for a miracle. What he didn't expect was to stop mid-step, his gaze caught on the woman crouched beneath the aircraft, tightening a landing gear bolt with the precision of someone performing surgery. His eyes dropped to her forearm. There it was. The tattoo. He stopped breathing for a second. The lines were the same. The mark was identical. A combat medic's insignia stylized in a way that only one person he knew had ever worn it. His pulse slowed. The noise around him faded. Because he knew that tattoo. He had watched it fade under blood and dust in the mountains of Kunar province. He had knelt beside it when its owner flatlined. And now, impossibly, it was right in front of him, alive, moving, whole. He didn't say a word, but everything was about to change. Rios didn't look up right away. She was crouched low beneath the ghost hawk, her hands buried in the landing gear housing, torque wrench twisting steadily as she rechecked the resistance on a gear coupling she didn't trust. It was the kind of job she could do with her eyes closed, and that was exactly why she stayed there longer than necessary. Something in the air had shifted. The hangar, usually a roar of machinery and loud banter, had gone still. She could feel eyes on her. Not the usual dismissive stares or mocking side glances. This was different. This was weight. This was recognition. Slowly, as she emerged from beneath the aircraft, wiping her hands on a rag as she stood, and that was when she saw him, Commander Ash Donovan, flanked by his team, standing like a statue in the middle of the bay, his eyes fixed not on her face, but on her forearm. Time didn't stop, but it slowed. She saw it happen. The breath caught in his chest, the twitch at the corner of his eye, the way his hand flexed once at his side before locking back into parade stillness. The rest of the bay was oblivious, at least for the moment. A few heads turned, more out of curiosity than anything else, but Rios knew. She recognized the look in Donovan's eyes. It wasn't just familiarity. It was disbelief. It was grief crashing into hope like a tidal wave, and she saw him struggling not to be swallowed by it. She wanted to look away, to retreat, to vanish back into the comfort of silence and anonymity, but it was too late. She gave him the faintest nod, not a greeting, not an invitation, but an acknowledgement. She knew who he was, and he knew that she knew. For the first time since arriving on the space, she felt the armor she'd built around herself begin to shift, not because she wanted it to, but because something inside her recognized that the mission, his mission, was the one she hadn't let herself believe could ever come full circle. Donovan took a slow step forward, still silent. Rios didn't move. Behind him, one of the SEALs, a tall, broad man with a scar cutting down from his temple to his jaw, took a staggered breath and whispered something too faint to hear. Rios didn't need to hear it. She saw the way his expression folded inward, the way his mouth opened and closed, like he was trying to speak through ghosts. Another member of the team, younger, with sandy hair and hollow eyes, just stared. His hands trembled. None of them made a sound, but Rios could feel it. The wave was coming. She didn't run. Instead, she turned and walked to her workstation. Every step echoed in the silence like a slow drumbeat, but she didn't rush. She moved with the calm she had cultivated in operating rooms and battlefield triage tents, where one wrung breath could mean death. She set the rag down, picked up her data pad, and keyed in her log for the Ghost Hawk's gear assembly. Her movements were precise, methodical.
She felt their eyes on her the entire time, and yet she never wavered. When she finished, she finally looked up again, not with the hollow, guarded eyes the hangar crew knew, but the sharp, assessing stare of someone who had once held men's lives in her hands and watched too many of them slip through her fingers. Donovan stepped forward again. This time he spoke, not loudly, not demanding, just a single name. Not her current one, but the name that had once been called on comms in frantic, blood-soaked missions. Riaz didn't flinch, but her jaw set. She looked at him, really looked at him, and the walls she'd built began to shift. Her shoulders shifted subtly. The posture of a mechanic faded. What replaced it wasn't dramatic, wasn't cinematic. It was quieter than that. But it was unmistakable. It was the straightening of her spine, the reset of her jaw, the lift in her gaze. It was the return of someone who had once been a combat medic so trusted, so embedded with the team that they called her Doc like it was more than a nickname. It was a bond. She didn't correct him. She didn't pretend she didn't know what he was talking about. She just nodded again, slower this time, and said the words she had been burying for 2 years. Her voice was low, steady, and final. The name she had once worn like a badge was not dead. It had been shelved, hidden under a new identity, beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape and trauma-induced silence, but now that identity was surfacing again, not because she wanted it, but because the people who needed it had found her.
Around them, the rest of the hangar was beginning to notice. The other techs glanced up from their stations, sensing something was off. Morales stood near the edge of Bay 1, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He didn't speak, but he nodded to himself once, as though confirming something he'd suspected for weeks. Others were slower to catch on. One asked what the SEALs were doing in their space. Another cracked a weak joke about needing to fix their truck. But the moment shattered completely when the scarred SEAL stepped forward, voice thick with disbelief, and called her by the same name Donovan had used, followed by one word that changed everything: medic. The hangar went silent. Rios didn't answer right away. She looked at each of them, the team she'd saved, the team that thought she'd died, the team that had carried her memory into every fight since. Then she turned to the aircraft behind her, the very one they would be flying into fire and darkness in less than a few hours, and walked back toward it. She reached into the service panel, rechecked a circuit, and closed the hatch with a metallic click. Only then did she speak again, and this time her voice carried, not loud, but firm, commanding, unshakable. "You'll be ready by launch. I'll be on that bird." She didn't ask for permission, she didn't explain, because Doc was back, and she had work to do. The next hour unfolded like a dream dropped into a war zone. Orders flew, crews scrambled. The base, already stretched thin, now surged with the kind of urgency that could only come from a mission on the brink. And at the center of it all was Rios, or rather Doc, as the SEALs now openly called her, no longer hiding the truth of who she was. The name echoed in the hangar, hushed at first, but growing louder as the implications settled over the personnel like ash after an explosion. No one had ever seen the SEALs defer to anyone like that. Not a commander, not a flight lead, and certainly not a mechanic. But here they were, these men built from steel and scars, standing silently while she moved among them with quiet authority. Her transformation wasn't flashy. She didn't put on a uniform or announce her credentials. She didn't demand respect or speak in declarations. Instead, she simply went to work, but differently now, no longer concealed behind silence. She moved like someone who had saved lives under fire. Her instructions were brief, direct, and impossible to ignore. She ordered 2 junior mechanics to reroute the environmental control system on the Ghost Hawk for better casualty stabilization. They blinked at her, stunned, until Donovan snapped his fingers and told them to move. She checked the medbase setup in the rear compartment, made 4 adjustments, then rewired the power couplings to allow full draw without tripping the thermal regulators. She rewrote the system settings from memory. No manuals, no hesitation. And when the aircraft's avionics package flagged a fault in the forward diagnostic relay, a problem that had stumped 2 engineers for a week, she traced it in under 5 minutes to a corrupted firmware patch that only occurred when external GPS priority was toggled mid-flight. She patched it with an override script she wrote on the spot using a secure line only certain field medics had access to. A line that had supposedly been decommissioned when her old team was marked lost in action. That was the moment Morales stepped forward, holding a report in one hand and looking at her not with suspicion, but with something closer to reverence. He didn't ask who she was anymore. He knew. Everyone did. Even those who had mocked her only days before. The airmen who called her Tattoo Barbie now stood back, silent, the words caught in their throats. One of them tried to stammer out a question, something about how long she'd been in, but the look on her face stopped him cold. She didn't need to prove anything. Her presence spoke louder than rank or record. But the real moment, the moment that shattered every lingering doubt, came when Commander Donovan handed her the SEAL team's encrypted med dossier. It was a critical file containing each operator's medical history, vulnerabilities, and contingency protocols for field trauma. It was only ever entrusted to a mission's combat medic. No one else had access. No one else was allowed to carry it. He offered it without a word, and she accepted it without hesitation, thumbing through the profiles as she memorized dosages, blood types, known injuries, and allergic reactions. Her fingers paused over a name, brows narrowing slightly. Someone new. She adjusted her mental protocols instantly. Behind her, the rest of the SEAL team stood in a half circle, watching her as if a ghost had returned to life. One of them whispered, not to anyone in particular, just out loud like a confession. He said he remembered the night they lost her, a mission gone sideways, mountain air thick with smoke, blood seeping into dirt, and a frantic final attempt to stabilize her after a blast took out their forward position. They'd gotten her on the bird, but she'd coded twice in flight. Command called it. She was gone, dead. They buried a flag with her name on it, held a memorial. Donovan never forgave himself. But she hadn't died. Not entirely. Through channels unknown to them, through layers of redacted reports and classified medical evacuations, she had been pulled back from the brink, reconstructed piece by piece in a hospital no one could name, then quietly shuffled into a non-combatant role under a new identity. It was easier, the doctor said. She wouldn't be a target, she wouldn't have to relive it. She could disappear. And so she did. Until now. Now, the mission was hers again.
Outside, the tarmac lights glowed under a pale dawn sky. The aircraft stood ready, blades still, power surging in their cores like sleeping beasts. Doc, stood at the ramp, arms crossed, waiting as Donovan made the final calls. Her bag, packed and sealed, sat beside her. It wasn't just a medic's kit, it was field trauma gear, surgical compression units, mobile diagnostics, and a black case locked with biometric ID. She hadn't unpacked that case since the day she was told she couldn't wear the uniform anymore. But today, it opened without a hitch. Inside were tools no mechanic would ever need, and every piece gleamed like she'd cleaned them last night. One of the junior officers, confused but trying to hide it, approached Commander Donovan and asked who the woman really was. Donovan stared at him for a long moment, then said only this: "She's the one who saved us when we were already dead. She's not just our medic. She's the reason we're alive." No further explanation followed. Within the hour, the Ghost Hawk would lift off, slicing through sky and storm toward a drop zone riddled with risk. But no one questioned its readiness now. No one wondered if the systems would fail or if the med team would hold. Doc was on board, and that changed everything. Because now they knew. They knew who she was, and more importantly, they knew what she could do. The rotor blades cut through the sky with that steady, rhythmic pulse that could lull a man into silence or brace him for impact, depending on what lay ahead. Inside the Ghost Hawk, tension coiled in the cabin like a second engine, vibrating beneath every strap, every helmet buckle, every clenched jaw. The SEAL team sat lined up along the bay, their eyes forward, silent,
their weapons checked and rechecked. The air was cold, the kind that slipped past even the thickest combat gear and whispered warnings across the skin. And seated among them, calm as a stone in the eye of a hurricane, was Doc. No one questioned her place anymore. She wore no insignia, no battle gear beyond her med bag and the matte black case she'd carried aboard, but her presence anchored the team like a fourth stabilizer. In flight, her eyes were never still. She tracked every movement, every shift in pressure, every flicker of data on the cockpit feed visible through the open bulkhead. She wasn't trying to take control. She didn't need to. She simply knew what came next. The moment arrived faster than expected. The insertion zone, already unstable due to rising wind shear and unpredictable thermal spikes, was now flanked by hostile activity. Intel confirmed movement near the extraction point, more than initially forecasted, with communications going dark from a forward recon drone. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset, reporting visual anomalies on infrared. The team prepared to deploy early, knowing this would no longer be a clean pickup. And then, just before the ramp lowered, Doc spoke. Her voice cut through the drone of the rotors and the rising tension like a scalpel through gauze. She didn't shout, didn't give a rousing speech. She simply laid out the reality. She reminded them of the heat patterns they'd likely encounter, that the terrain wouldn't match the outdated maps Command had briefed them with. She noted that the elevation would interfere with auto-stabilizers during descent, and that if anyone took a hit, the tourniquet window would close in under 3 minutes. She listed, from memory, each man's blood type and the pre-existing injuries they'd been carrying since deployment, even the ones they hadn't admitted. And then she told them how they would get home. She didn't promise safety. She didn't offer blind comfort. Instead, she gave them certainty. That if they fell, she would be there. That if they bled, she would hold the line. That no matter how dark it got, she would not let them die alone. It wasn't bravado. It was a vow. One she had made long ago in places much worse than this. One carved not in words, but in the muscles of her hands and the stillness of her breath when a life depended on her keeping both steady. They didn't nod. They didn't reply. They didn't need to. The weight in the air shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it became something else. Something harder, sharper. They had gone to war with other medics, some capable and some not, but none like her. Because she wasn't just trained, she was forged. The mission unfolded in chaos, as they often did. The landing was hot, the drop zone compromised within seconds. Gunfire split the dawn. 2 operators took hits before they cleared the first ridge. One collapsed behind cover, pressure wave trauma to the chest plate, and another suffered a glancing round to the thigh. It wasn't supposed to go like this, but then again, it never did. Doc moved like smoke. She was there before they called her, already stabilizing the bleeding, already adjusting respirator flow and administering microdoses to combat shock. She carried no weapon, but the way she moved between the fire was like someone born in the middle of it. The team made the pickup, but it wasn't clean. They lost comms, lost altitude control for 30 seconds, and barely cleared the extraction point with one engine stalling on final ascent. The flight back was a gauntlet of triage and emergency protocols. One man crashed mid-cabin with fluid in his lungs. Doc performed pericardiocentesis mid-flight using nothing but a field syringe and the corner of a transport crate for leverage. The pilot swore later he saw her reset a collapsed airway with a pen cap and a piece of tubing stripped from the internal oxygen system. No one questioned it.
They watched her work with the kind of silence that only comes from awe. Not fear, not worship, but reverence for something sacred. By the time they landed, the man she'd pulled back from the edge of death was breathing on his own. 2 others stabilized, the rest bruised but alive. And as the ramp lowered and base personnel rushed forward to assist, the first thing they saw was Doc stepping off the bird, streaked in blood that wasn't hers, hands still steady, face unreadable. The briefing after was formal, the debrief short, but word traveled faster than orders ever could. Across the hangar, across the base, across the channels that mattered, people now spoke her name with weight. Not just the female mechanic or the one with the weird tattoo. Now they called her by the name that had meaning. Now they remembered. And when the crew gathered later that evening, bruised, patched up, sitting on crates in the hangar with heat lamps humming overhead, someone asked the question they hadn't dared before. Why come back? Why return to a place that had stripped her identity, buried her past, and shoved her into silence? Doc paused, eyes distant, scanning the flight deck as if seeing every broken bolt she'd ever tightened, every engine she'd ever coaxed back to life. She said it softly, but it carried. Because hiding what you are doesn't protect you. It just starves the people who need you. I didn't come back for recognition. I came back because they were going to fly that bird into the dark without anyone ready to catch them if they fell. And I don't let people fall. Not if I can help it. That was all she said. But in that moment, everyone understood. Respect doesn't come from shouting the loudest or looking the part. It comes from doing the work, even when no one's watching. It comes from showing up when it counts. And above all, it comes from never letting someone's judgment define your purpose. The base didn't change overnight, not in the way a building collapses and gets rebuilt with new blueprints, but subtle transformations rippled through its structure like heat rising off the tarmac, quiet and invisible at first, then unmistakable the closer one looked. The same hangar where Doc, had once been overlooked, scoffed at, and misjudged, was now a place where footsteps slowed when she entered. Not out of fear or awe, but out of respect. Conversations hushed, not because people were afraid of her rank, she still had none, but because they knew they had misjudged her and were still learning what that meant. She moved through the maintenance bays not like a ghost anymore, but like a compass that pointed north true, her presence silently recalibrating those who worked around her. The same junior techs who once avoided her eyes now leaned in closer when she spoke. They asked questions about procedures they didn't understand, listened carefully when she explained not just what to do, but why it mattered. She no longer had to prove she belonged. She never had to begin with, but now the base, piece by piece, began to understand the depth of what she had carried all along. She didn't wear medals or bark orders or stand behind a desk. She taught by doing, and that kind of leadership couldn't be faked or forged through rank. It had to be earned in sweat, in blood, and in the silence of sacrifice. One morning, a lieutenant from supply brought her a mug of coffee, unprompted. He stood there awkwardly for a second before blurting out that his brother had been saved by a medic during a dust-off in Mosul, someone who worked under blackout conditions and kept him breathing with nothing but field gauze and a stick of adrenaline. He said he didn't know her name, but after watching Doc work, he was starting to think maybe she wasn't the only ghost walking among them. Doc didn't answer. She just nodded once, took the coffee, and kept working on the hydraulic system of a grounded Osprey. But later that night, she left a folded diagram of field med protocols on the lieutenant's desk, with a note in careful handwriting, in case your brother ever needs a second round. Even Morales changed. The man who had once given her the silent treatment, who had reduced her to her ink and gender and handed her the worst assignments, now found himself unsure of how to approach her. The first time he tried, it came out awkward and stilted, asking if she needed more hands for the next repair cycle. She said she had it covered. The second time, he asked if she could give the crew a quick session on emergency med evac readiness, just in case the next mission went sideways. She said yes, and 2 hours later delivered a lesson so surgical and impactful that the usually noisy maintenance deck went completely still. Morales stood in the back, arms crossed, watching her like a man seeing something for the first time. Not a mechanic, not a woman, just someone infinitely more capable than he'd allowed himself to believe. And then there were the SEALs. They weren't stationed there permanently, but the aftermath of that mission etched into the base's story like a scar that never quite healed. Every time they returned for a briefing, a supply run, or another launch, the atmosphere changed.
Where they once walked like gods among mortals, confident and untouchable, now they carried themselves with a different kind of humility. They spoke to the mechanics. They shook hands with crew chiefs. They offered to lift their own gear. Not because anyone asked them to, but because the person they respected most on that flight line had taught them that no one was too good to do the hard work.
Donovan, especially, made it a point to check in. Not publicly, not in front of the others, but always with precision. A nod here, a question there. One afternoon, he asked if she still had the black case, the one they'd all thought lost when the explosion buried her identity. She said yes, it was cleaned and repacked. He asked if she'd kept anything else from that life. She told him she had only kept the memory of what it meant to matter when things fell apart, and the discipline to never forget how fragile that thread could be. Donovan didn't speak after that. He just offered her a handshake. She took it without hesitation. When he left, he called her Doc without even thinking. Other personnel who had once whispered about her began seeking her out. A new airman named Tally admitted during a late-night refit that she'd joined the mechanical corps because her brother had died waiting for a medevac that never came. She said she never thought she'd meet someone who had made it out from the other side of that kind of story. Doc listened, then taught her how to field calibrate a stabilizer under heat stress. It wasn't sympathy, it was legacy. Passing on the knowledge to someone who might someday be the only line between death and survival for someone else's brother. Even the base commander, Colonel Grayson, who had barely acknowledged Doc beyond a personnel file, made a quiet visit to the maintenance hangar one evening. No fanfare, just a walk across the tarmac under sodium lights, clipboard in hand. He said he was reviewing logistics. Everyone knew that wasn't why he came. He stood for a long moment beside the bird Doc had helped rewire, the same one that carried the SEALs back alive. Then he asked her one question. If you ever wanted a full reinstatement, would you take it? She looked at the bird, then back at him, and said, only if they need me there more than here. He nodded. And that was it. That was all it took to erase years of misjudgment. Not because he suddenly understood her, but because he finally respected her answer. No one apologized with grand speeches or medals. No one handed her a plaque or called a ceremony. But the hangar changed. The air changed. When she spoke, people listened. When she walked in, people made space, not out of fear, but out of recognition. They still called her Rios sometimes, but more often than not, they called her Doc. And they said it with pride. Because now they knew. Now they saw. And she didn't need revenge. She didn't want it. What she wanted was this: a world where those who were overlooked could rise, and those who once judged could learn. A world where what you looked like mattered far less than what you did when things fell apart. And for the first time in a long time, that world felt possible. The sun cracked across the horizon like an ember pushed too far, bleeding orange and gold over the base's windswept edge. Mornings at Altair Station were always stark. No birdsong, no buzzing cityscape, just the slow crescendo of machinery humming to life, steel groaning under temperature shifts, and boots thudding softly against concrete. But something else now lingered in that silence. Respect, perhaps. A different kind of quiet. One that didn't come from being ignored, but from being seen. It wasn't loud, not performative, but it was present, everywhere. Doc stood just outside Hangar Delta, her jumpsuit already dusted and fine grit from a gearbox overhaul she'd started before most of the base had even had coffee. Her hair was tucked under a bandana, oil streaks darkening her sleeves, and a faint smear of hydraulic fluid ran across her cheekbone, like war paint. She was right where she'd always been. The difference now wasn't in her, it was in the people who finally understood what they were looking at. The younger techs now orbited her like moths to flame, though they rarely spoke unless she opened the door.
She didn't indulge arrogance, didn't flatter ignorance, but if someone asked with sincerity, she gave them more than just instructions, she gave them confidence. It was the same way she had once taught field trauma in the dirt beneath a rotor shadow, showing green medics how to push through chaos without freezing. And just like back then, she expected them to remember, not to write it down, to know it, to hold it, because someone's life might depend on it one day. Still, some wounds didn't heal as visibly. There was a hesitancy in the air that never quite disappeared, an awareness from those who had once dismissed her that no apology could completely undo their mistake. The ones who had laughed the loudest now watched her from a distance. Some tried to inch their way back into conversation, offering small gestures, coffee, tools handed over without being asked, even cleared space on the workbench. But most never quite found the courage to say what needed to be said. And she never asked for it. The best apology was changed behavior, and as long as they followed her lead now, that was enough. But not everyone found peace in the revelation of who she was. There were whispers from the upper rungs of command, quiet questioning of protocol, concerns about identity security, inquiries into why someone with a blacklisted service record and a presumed dead status was operating openly within a classified unit. Rumors floated through thin air like ash, that someone at CentralCom was reopening her file, that another SEAL team had requested her presence off book, that the case of the ghost medic had made its way to a senator's desk. The bureaucracy didn't know what to do with her. She was an anomaly, a reminder that the system had cracks wide enough to swallow its own heroes.
Morales, now fully transformed in his relationship with her, pulled her aside one evening and handed her a sealed envelope. It was marked with a security tag 2 levels above his clearance, but he'd intercepted it during a routing conflict and figured she should know before it reached the wrong desk. Inside was a notice of identity integrity review, a polite term for an investigation. Not criminal, not disciplinary, but invasive nonetheless. Doc read it once, folded it back neatly, and set it down without flinching. Morales watched her, waiting for a sign of panic or frustration. Instead, she asked him if the stabilizers on the Ghost Hawk had been realigned. He said yes. That was the end of it. But beneath that calm, a familiar ache stirred. Not fear, not regret, but weariness. She had come back to serve, not to explain herself to people who would never understand what it cost her to survive. Still, if they wanted to dig up the past, let them. Everything they'd find would point to one truth. She had always been more than what they saw, and she wasn't going to disappear again. The SEALs were the only ones who didn't seem rattled by the growing attention. They carried on as usual, training hard, rotating through missions, occasionally returning to Altair between deployments. Each time, without fail, they made their way to her, sometimes to talk, sometimes to sit in silence while she worked. They didn't need answers, they had them already, burned into their skin with every scar she'd once stitched shut in the field. One of them, Cutter, even brought her a patch, a faded unit insignia from their last mission before she went missing. It had her initials stitched crudely into the border. He said they kept it on every mission since, never knowing why. She didn't say a word, just pressed it into her palm and tucked it into her bag. Later that week, during a rare downtime cycle, she climbed to the watchtower above the perimeter fence. She stood there alone, watching the desert breathe under a setting sun, her shadow long across the platform. It was the same tower she'd stood on during her first week, back when no one knew her name and some thought she was just a temporary tech. Back then, her silence had been a shell. Now it was a choice, a space of reflection, a vantage point not just over the base, but over everything that had changed. Below, the lights of the hangars flickered on, one by one. Mechanics moved like clockwork, but there was more rhythm now, more cooperation, more trust.
Her presence had recalibrated the entire ecosystem, and she had done it without demanding anything but the chance to serve. She wasn't here for recognition. She never was. But now, for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like exile. It felt like peace. A month after the events that redefined Altair Station's pulse, a strange thing began to happen. It wasn't a grand announcement, nor was it orchestrated by command. It started in the form of a letter, handwritten and folded in quarters, slipped beneath a toolkit on the far end of the maintenance bay. Doc found it just before sunrise, tucked near the intake manifold she was inspecting. The handwriting was messy but earnest, and the words were simple. They told me my file didn't matter. You showed me that it does. No name, no rank, just a ripple. She didn't need to know who wrote it. She folded it, tucked it into her back pocket, and resumed her work. But something shifted that morning, like a pebble tossed into still water. The next came from a comms officer, a quiet woman named Anders, who had barely spoken more than 2 sentences to Doc since her arrival. This time it wasn't a letter, it was a gesture. She rewired the hangar's external speakers to play morning announcements in Doc's preferred frequency range, knowing the high-pitched signals interfered with her post-blast hearing. She never mentioned it, neither did Doc, but the silence between them began to hold a kind of reverence. And so it continued. Small actions, each one echoing further than the last. It was as if the moment Doc's true identity emerged, it cracked something open in others, a realization that maybe their own silences, their own hidden strengths were waiting to be acknowledged too. Requests began to pour in, not from command, but from the crew. Airmen wanted her to teach them emergency triage. Mechanics asked her for input on contingency protocols. Even logistics officers started inviting her into planning meetings for crisis redundancies. She had no rank that required her to participate, yet she accepted every time, not because she craved influence, but because she understood the weight of readiness. She knew what it meant to be the last thread holding chaos at bay. Her presence didn't just elevate those around her, it reminded them of what was possible when expertise and humility walked hand in hand. Meanwhile, whispers from outside Altair began to grow louder. The investigation into her past, while still technically ongoing, had taken a strange turn. Her old unit records, long classified or marked as KIA, presumed lost, began to resurface in fragments. Photos of missions in the Kandahar valleys, reports bearing her field moniker, Echo 3, and a final redacted memo that simply read, "Critical medic lost in theater, presumed no survivors." But there had been one, and now, because of the SEAL team's eyewitness statements and the successful exfil that bore her name in every debrief, her existence could no longer be buried beneath bureaucracy.
At the same time, something else began to stir beneath the polished surface of command, something both more delicate and more dangerous. The base commander, Colonel Brayson, invited her to a secure briefing without warning. It was the first time she had been asked into the inner room, the sealed steel conference chamber used only for top-level tactical discussion. When she arrived, he didn't ask her to sit. He simply handed her a file and stood back. Inside were orders, not for reassignment, but for observation, a detached oversight role on an upcoming joint operation between Altair and a foreign special operations unit. They wanted her eyes, her judgment. No uniform, no insignia, just trust. He asked her, carefully, if she was willing. She didn't answer with words. She opened the folder again, scanned the op structure, memorized the critical lines, and nodded once. It was enough. As she turned to leave, Grayson said her name. Not Rios, not mechanic. He called her Doc. And in that single syllable, years of dismissal melted into something honest. The mission prep began 2 days later. She wasn't on the flight manifest, but she moved among the teams like a ghost in the system, watching, listening, offering silent corrections when a procedure faltered or a checklist missed a key item. The operators didn't question her presence. They had heard the stories, Some had served alongside men who owed her their lives. Her reputation traveled faster than rank ever could. But with recognition came risk. Doc knew that, and so did those who had once tried to bury her past. Midway through the mission prep, she received a coded message through the logistics relay. No origin, no signature, just this: there are still those who prefer you gone. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. The system she had slipped through once wouldn't forget so easily. But she was done hiding. Let them come. If survival had taught her anything, it was that silence could be weaponized. But it could also be broken. And when it was, it changed everything. Back at the base, her influence reached places she never touched directly. Maintenance crews began rotating through cross-medical training voluntarily. A bulletin appeared on the rec room wall titled "Skills Don't Wear Uniforms," with her image beside it. A candid shot of her in the middle of a briefing, hands marked in grease and eyes fierce with focus. No one claimed authorship, but it remained pinned up, untouched, unvandalized for weeks. The air itself felt different now. Not lighter. Altair was still a place of grind and discipline, but clearer, cleaner. A place where the hidden weren't forgotten, where competence had room to rise through concrete. Doc hadn't just shifted culture, she had remapped it. And yet in all the movement, she stayed the same. Same bunk, same tools, same quiet demeanor. But when she passed through a corridor, heads didn't turn because of rumor or curiosity anymore. They turned because she had become the heartbeat of something larger. Proof that those who endured the most quietly often carried the most weight. This wasn't her redemption. It was their awakening. The dust never truly settled in the desert. It lingered in the air like unfinished business, swirling in corners and clinging to skin, a constant reminder that stillness was never permanent. Doc stood beneath the skeletal frame of a half-gutted recon drone, tools arrayed before her in a meticulous semicircle, her hands blackened by a morning of grinding and calibration. From a distance, she looked like any other mechanic, focused, methodical, lost in the symphony of repair. But inside, she was navigating a far more delicate operation, the kind with no blueprints, no visible parts, and no definitive outcome. The investigation into her past had morphed into something more aggressive. What began as curiosity had evolved into a strategic effort by shadowed figures and distant offices to determine whether she was a threat or an embarrassment. Neither answer would serve her well. It started with small intrusions, personal data requests, MINA clearances being mysteriously revoked, and access logs showing login attempts from outside the base. Then came the unmarked observers. They arrived under the pretense of auditing Altair's training protocols, but never once stepped near a classroom. Instead, they lingered near her hangar, watched her movements, took quiet notes when she spoke. They didn't engage, they didn't accuse, but their presence tightened the air like a noose with no rope. Colonel Grayson gave her no formal warning, but one glance between them in the command hallway told her everything. His jaw was clenched, his nod was short. She was on her own. What they didn't understand, what they never could, is that she had lived under scrutiny before. She knew how to survive in shadows. These new bureaucratic hunters thought they were cornering a technician with a questionable past. They didn't realize they were stepping into the world of someone who had dragged broken bodies through enemy fire while bleeding from her own wounds. Someone who kept dying men alive long enough for airlift because she refused to be their final memory. She didn't just fix things, she refused to let them break. But even strength has seams, and late at night, when the hangar emptied and the base lights dimmed, Doc sometimes sat alone on the steel catwalk above the flight bay, legs dangling over the edge, her fingers ghosting the outline of the tattoo on her forearm. The ink had faded slightly, softened at the edges, but its meaning burned brighter than ever. It wasn't just a symbol of her past, it was a living reminder of everything she had fought for and everyone she'd lost. And now, it was also a target.
One night, as she sat on that catwalk, a quiet rustle broke the silence. She didn't flinch. Her senses, honed by years in volatile terrain, identified the gate long before the figure emerged. Morales. He climbed the ladder slowly, his expression shadowed by something more than fatigue. In his hand was a data slate. He didn't speak, just handed it to her and waited. She scanned it quickly. Internal comms, classified excerpts, a memo flagged as escalation review. They were preparing a report on her operational exposure, a move that often preceded forced relocation or silent discharge. There was no accusation of wrongdoing, no violation of duty, just concern about the optics of unverified heroism. She laughed once, sharp and short, more out of disbelief than humor. Morales didn't laugh. He looked at her the way someone looks at a levee that's held too long, waiting to see if it will crack or hold. She handed the slate back without a word, and he slid down the ladder without pushing for more. He knew better. The following morning, she reported to the training field, not because she had to, but because every rumor, every passive threat, every whisper of reassignment deserved an answer. Not with defiance, with demonstration. She ran the entire field medic obstacle course solo, a feat most couldn't complete even in pairs. She stabilized a dummy under simulated fire, applied a tourniquet while blindfolded, scaled a wall with a rescue sled strapped to her back, and administered triage protocols on a biochemical leak sim with no assistance. The younger trainees watched in stunned silence. The observers were there too, their clipboards forgotten in their hands. When she finished, soaked in sweat and streaked in red powder from the simulation grenades, she didn't speak. She just walked off the course, tossed her gloves into the bin, and returned to the hangar. That afternoon, the memo Morales showed her mysteriously vanished from the base network. No follow-up ever came, no reassignment was issued, and though the observers didn't leave immediately, their posture changed. Less interrogation, more caution. But the incident lit a fuse beneath something deeper. Word of the event spread beyond Altair. Other units began requesting debriefs with her. Operators from other bases asked if she could review their trauma kits. A special operations medic from another branch sent her a message. Didn't believe the stories. Now I do. We need people like you back on the line. The echo she had sparked now bounced through the ranks, growing louder with each new listener. Still, she remained rooted. Not because she feared moving, but because Altair had become more than just a station. It had become a symbol. If she left now, it would confirm the narrative that someone like her didn't belong, that exposure must be followed by exile. So she stayed. Not to prove herself, but to anchor the proof already given. Each day she worked. She taught, she advised. And each night she returned to the catwalk, staring out into the dark with quiet resolve, because she knew the fight wasn't over. The real battle wasn't one of bullets or badges. It was the battle to be believed, to be remembered rightly, and to be allowed to serve, not in spite of the past, but because of it. And in that silence, she was winning. The night air around Altair Station had begun to cool, the harsh desert winds retreating as the season shifted, but there was a tension humming beneath the surface, a frequency just below audible, as if the base itself were holding its breath. Doc felt it in her bones before it ever appeared in the chain of command. She'd learned long ago that something always stirred before the storm, a silence too clean, a hallway too quiet, a sudden surge of classified transmissions routed through channels that didn't match protocol. She didn't need clearance to read the signs. Experience taught her to listen to what wasn't said. That morning, while tightening the intake coupling on a hybrid rotorcraft, her comm unit chirped, not the regular base channel, but a secure ping she hadn't heard in years. It came coded through an older encryption protocol, one no longer used by the current military network, but still alive in the ghost systems, the kind only a few medics and operators from a certain generation remembered. Her breath caught. She wiped her hands, stepped away from the tool bench, and ducked into the supply bay where signals were weakest. The message was short, nothing more than an alphanumeric chain and a location. But she knew immediately it was a call sign, a designation for a lost unit, her unit. Echo team had been scattered, presumed dead, most of them listed as KIA in operations that were never officially acknowledged. Doc had buried more of them than she cared to count. But this signal didn't come from the past. It was live. Someone was calling back through the wire. She sat still for minutes, weighing the possibilities. A trap was likely, a test even more so, but she'd been tested her entire life, and every time she played it safe, someone else paid the price. So she suited up,
Not in armor, not in official gear, but in what she trusted. Reinforced cargo pants, a weathered field pack, and the sidearm she had never relinquished even after her so-called discharge. She checked out a recon bike under her usual maintenance clearance and left the compound under the pretense of a system calibration run. No one questioned her. They'd learned by now that she didn't leave unless it mattered. The coordinates took her 22 clicks east, past the drone perimeter and into the jagged outcroppings beyond a dune shelf. There, nestled between stone walls and obscured by decades of erosion, sat an old forward operations relay station, long since decommissioned.
She killed the engine, stashed the bike, and approached on foot. The air was dry and still. No wind, no movement. Just the sound of her boots over sand and the faint buzz of a dormant power cell. Still active, barely, after all these years. She entered the relay station slowly, weapon down but eyes alert. Inside, it was dark, except for a single console blinking with a steady green pulse. She moved closer. The screen flickered once, then displayed a message. Doc Rios, if you're seeing this, they weren't all lost. Her throat tightened. The message continued. We got out. A few of us. They scrubbed the op, erased the manifests, but not all of us died in that canyon. You went dark. We thought you were gone too. If you're seeing this, come find us. We're still fighting, just not under the flag anymore. There were no names, no signature, just coordinates. Deeper into the no-go zones, places where command didn't patrol and where signals went to die. She stared at the screen long after it dimmed, the weight of it pressing against every scar she carried. Somewhere out there, her people, or what remained of them, were still moving, still surviving. But this wasn't just about reunion. This was about reckoning. If Echo Team had survived and been erased, what else had the system hidden? How many others had been cast aside when they became inconvenient? Her revelation at Altair had already rattled cages, but this was different. This was proof, the kind that could dismantle the quiet machinery that buried truth beneath layers of policy. She returned to the base before dawn, the ride back rough and silent. As the sun breached the horizon, she walked into the comms bunker and requested a secured session with Grayson. When he arrived, bleary-eyed and armored in official disinterest, she didn't wait for pleasantries. She dropped the portable data slate on his desk, keyed in the encryption manually, and stepped back as the screen lit up with the message she'd seen. She watched his expression harden, not with disbelief, but with understanding. He looked up at her then, really looked, and for the first time there was no rank between them, just two people standing in the space between duty and truth. How long do we have? He asked. She didn't flinch. Not long. The system knows I found something. They'll move fast. He nodded. No resistance, no hesitation, just action. Then we move faster. That day, Altair Station changed again, not with speeches or orders, but with a quiet mobilization. Files were pulled from dead archives, old names were run through forgotten databases, and beneath it all, Doc moved like a current, connecting past to present, memory to mission. The silence that had once threatened to bury her now became her greatest weapon. Because in that silence lived names they'd tried to erase, people who had bled, fought, and survived without applause. This wasn't just about reclaiming her name anymore. This was about restoring all of theirs. The first to arrive came in silence, not through the front gate, not in a convoy, but one by one. Unmarked vehicles, old satchels, dust on their boots, and eyes that had seen wars no one wrote about. They didn't check in, they didn't salute, they didn't ask for permission to be on base. They came because of her, because someone, after all these years, had sent a signal worth answering. Echo Team, or what remained of it, began to converge on Altair like shadows stepping into daylight. Some had new names, others had no names at all. A few bore scars too deep for the eye to see, but all of them recognized her the moment they saw the faded tattoo on her forearm. That mark, once mocked, now burned like a torch. There was no grand reunion, no emotional overtures or embraces. That wasn't their way.
Their shared past was too raw, too built on grit and silence and the thin thread of trust that had once kept them alive behind enemy lines. Instead, they spoke in clipped phrases, brief nods, unfinished sentences that said more than whole debriefings ever could. They examined the perimeter, the logistics of the base, not for defense, but for leverage. They knew what she was preparing for even if she hadn't spoken it out loud. Exposure. And exposure came with consequences. The presence of Echo Team spread through Altair like wildfire. At first, soldiers whispered, then the officers noticed. Suddenly, old names were circulating again, names thought long erased, names associated with black operations and units that didn't officially exist. Some of the instructors who had once chuckled at Doc's assignments now kept their distance. Others approached in quiet apology, unsure of what they were stepping into. But the SEALs, the very ones who had once dismissed her, saw her differently now. They saw the quiet way the Echo Team deferred to her. They saw the way Morales stood a little straighter in her presence. They watched Grayson consult her before making any move. They saw something that went beyond rank. It was reverence. Earned, not given.
So they worked. Quietly, efficiently, they consolidated records, traced comms, reconstructed incident logs from shredded fragments. They tapped into satellite pings long forgotten, extracted metadata from mission files that had been scrubbed, built timelines of betrayal with the same precision they'd once used to clear rooms and extract hostages. And all the while, Doc anchored it all. Her knowledge of the medical records, the hidden injuries, the last-minute changes to insertion points, her memory was a living archive of what the official documents tried to erase. Late one night, Morales found her in the hangar, sitting at the workbench where the drone parts had been replaced by stacks of decrypted reports and cross-referenced maps. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, watching the light flicker over her inked arm, the mark that had once sparked derision now drawing warriors back from the dead. After a long pause, he finally asked her the question no one else had dared to speak aloud. Why now? She didn't look up. Her voice was quiet but firm. She said it wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration, about the ones who didn't make it back, the ones who had died thinking no one would remember their names, about the young recruits now signing up under illusions and half-truths, about showing the next generation that honor wasn't always wrapped in medals and citations. Sometimes it was carried in silence, in scars, in loyalty that never faded. Sometimes the only way to serve was to break the very system that failed you. Morales didn't reply. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and took his place beside her, reviewing data packets she handed him. One by one, others joined, not just Echo Team, but Altair's own. Engineers, techs, and even a few junior officers who had once turned the other way now stepped forward. They didn't all understand the full story, but they understood her. That was enough. Within days, the evidence was ready, a complete dossier tracing the obliteration of Echo Team, the falsified records, the manipulation of combat logs, and the post-operation cover-ups. But more than that, it contained testimonies, dozens of them, from across the spectrum of the military, of lives altered or destroyed by the silencing of those who had seen too much. Doc's name was the signature on the final page, not as a whistleblower, but as a medic, a witness, a soldier. And with that, the plan moved to its final phase. They weren't going to leak it. They weren't going to hide behind anonymous uploads or shadow forums. They were going to deliver it directly to command, to the tribunal board, to the press if needed. Not as an attack, but as a reckoning. If the truth was a weapon, then it needed to be wielded with surgical precision. As the final files were uploaded and the last signatures collected, Doc stood at the threshold of the hangar, the desert wind tugging at her jacket. The stars stretched wide above Altair, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost passing through someone else's story. She felt present, whole. Not because of what she had reclaimed, but because of what she was about to give away. The truth. Tomorrow would come fast, and with it, the reaction. But tonight, beneath that vast sky, surrounded by the warriors who had once trusted her with their lives, Doc didn't feel fear. She felt ready.
The morning Altier station broke its silence. The sky was a strange mix of gold and iron gray, like nature itself couldn't decide whether to herald a sunrise or a storm. In the command center, the sealed file marked Code Sierra Reclaim was hand-delivered by an unranked courier. No insignia, no preamble, just a small device with a biometric lock keyed only to the highest chain of command and a simple attached note. Read it all, then decide if you still want to be proud of the flag. Within an hour, the room became a theater of silent expressions, eyes wide, shoulders drawn, denial flickering behind practiced authority as decades of buried truths began unfurling on their screens. Names they'd written off, faces long forgotten, dates that didn't align with official reports. The intricate web laid bare. Meanwhile, back at the hangar, Doc stood quietly beside the reinforced crates packed for rapid deployment, not because she planned to run, but because she knew what came next. When you exposed a system, it retaliated first with silence, then with force. Echo Team was scattered around the base in plain clothes, blending in but fully prepared. The others, Morales, Grayson, and a few of the younger recruits who'd come to trust her, lingered nearby, waiting for the hammer to fall. She had told them not to stay. Most of them had ignored her. By midday, the base was no longer just a base. It was a fault line. Two unspoken sides had formed, not official factions, but something more primal. Those who had seen enough to believe, and those who feared what believing meant. No orders were issued, no sirens wailed, but everyone knew something seismic was happening. Soldiers who had once dismissed her now eyed her warily, unsure whether she was a traitor or a liberator. Some of them saluted her. Others turned their backs. When the black transport finally landed on the south tarmac, the rotors stirred up more than dust. They stirred up judgment. The brass had arrived. Real brass. Suits with stars on their collars and records too redacted to read. They walked with the confidence of men used to being feared. And yet, when they entered the room where Doc and Grayson waited, that confidence faltered. The first thing they saw was the wall, an entire operations board covered in map timelines, mission tags, erased names, and above it all, one image. A younger Doc Rios in full gear, arm bloodied, dragging a wounded operator out of enemy fire. Below it, a single phrase in bold print. We were there.
They didn't ask questions, not at first. They simply demanded the shutdown of all communication relays and the isolation of every device tied to the file drop. Grayson refused. His voice was calm but immovable. He said the information had already propagated to the central database. Attempting to bury it now would only guarantee its viral spread. The truth had reached critical mass. The only question left was how they chose to respond, with integrity or with cover-up. Doc watched their faces carefully. These were men who had operated for decades behind layers of plausible deniability. They weren't evil, necessarily, just too far gone in a system that rewarded omission. One of them, a general with a sharp jaw and the kind of postures that hadn't faltered since basic, turned to her and asked if she had any final words before formal action was taken. Formal action. The words rang like a bell of bureaucracy, hollow and practiced. She stepped forward, slowly, every step echoing louder than the last. Then she spoke, not with anger, not with desperation, but with the even cadence of someone who had nothing left to hide. She told them about Operation Hushed Veil, the one that never made it to briefing halls. She detailed the field extractions, the ignored medical requests, the overwritten casualty reports. She recounted how Echo Team had been sent in under false pretenses, bait for a proxy conflict that was never meant to succeed. And she told them the truth about the aftermath, how she was left behind, body half broken, spirit nearly shattered, until a civilian convoy pulled her from the edge of nowhere. She didn't name names. She didn't accuse. She simply gave facts. Hard, unrelenting facts. When she finished, no one clapped. No one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't from disbelief, but from the weight of belief finally settling. One of the brass muttered that this would destroy careers. Another said it would ignite hearings. But one, the oldest among them, only nodded once and whispered that it was about time. About damn time.
News spread fast, as it always did in places pretending to be isolated. Within hours, feeds across internal military networks flickered to life with segments of the story. Soldiers from bases far beyond Altair sent encrypted acknowledgments. Retired operatives reached out with corroborating logs. Journalists began asking dangerous questions. And somewhere in the civilian grid, a leak had already landed in a secure forum for veterans, one where the phrase, "we were there," was beginning to trend. Back on base, something strange happened. The air shifted. The dismissive stares Doc had lived under for months became something else. Not fear, not pity, but recognition. A young recruit approached her near the motor pool, visibly nervous, and asked if the tattoo meant something more than just a symbol. Doc didn't answer. She just rolled up her sleeve fully, revealing the faded letters below the mark once lost under grime and oil. It read, "Semper Presens," always present. That night, Echo Team gathered in the hangar not to hide, but to stand. Not fugitives, not ghosts, but survivors bearing the weight of a history that would no longer be erased. Grayson submitted his official resignation, only to have it rejected with a commendation. Morales was offered command of a new tactical unit, one dedicated to internal integrity, and Doc was asked to train. Not just soldiers, but leaders. The transformation wasn't loud. It didn't come with ceremonies or flag foldings. It came in the quiet shift of a culture finally looking at itself in the mirror. It came in the morning salutes from those who had once scoffed. It came in the unspoken unity of those who now understood that valor wore many faces, and sometimes it wore grease-stained coveralls and a fading ink tattoo. The truth, once unmasked, had done what all weapons hope to do. It had changed the field of battle. The autumn winds swept across Altera Station like they were trying to erase the memory of what had happened there, but the truth once unearthed refused to be buried again. Everything had changed, not in a grand cinematic upheaval, but in the quiet way tectonic plates shift, transforming the landscape forever. Echo Team no longer had to hide in plain sight. They were no longer remnants of a ghost operation, denied and redacted out of existence. They were advisors now, instructors, protectors of the very institution that once abandoned them. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't even about vindication. It was about finally being seen for who they were, fully and without qualification. For Doc, the days following the revelation blurred into one long march of closure. She met with investigators, stood before internal panels, and gave testimony not to incriminate, but to illuminate. She described her role not as a hero, but as a medic who simply refused to leave anyone behind. The tattoo on her arm, once mocked and misread, had become an unofficial emblem around the base, replicated on patches, notebooks, even painted discreetly on the side of a rebuilt transport plane, a serpent coiled around a wrench, cradling a heartbeat line through the center. A mark once dismissed as decoration was now understood as a symbol of sacrifice, knowledge, and resilience. Its meaning had outgrown the ink. Captain Grayson remained at her side, as did Morales and the others, bound by something deeper than chain of command. They had walked through fire together, and now they were building something that would outlast them. The base had begun integrating a new training module, codenamed Phoenix Protocol, focusing on psychological resilience, integrity in command structures, and recognizing non-traditional assets and teams. Doc wrote most of the curriculum herself, not from theory, but from memory. She taught in the same motor pool she had once been laughed out of, now cleared and retrofitted into a mobile tactical classroom. Recruits listened differently now.
With reverence, with readiness. There were no speeches about glory, no inflated promises about honor, just truth, laid bare like a battlefield wound. One of the biggest changes came quietly. The Navy reclassified Operation Hushed Veil and released a public statement acknowledging the lost personnel, correcting mission data that had been suppressed for years. A digital memorial was created, and for the first time, the names of the original Echo Team were etched into the ledger of service. Families who had lived with silence finally received clarity. The lie had unraveled completely, but it hadn't left only wreckage. It had made room for restoration. Weeks later, Doc received a handwritten letter from the daughter of an operator who had died on that mission. The girl had grown up believing her father had gone rogue, abandoned his post, dishonored his team. But now, with the truth revealed, she knew he had died saving civilians, protecting the very men and women he'd been accused of betraying. She wrote that she'd seen the photo of Doc carrying her father's body to the extraction zone, bleeding but unrelenting. She thanked her not for surviving, but for not letting the world forget what really happened. Doc kept the letter in her locker, folded between the pages of a dog-eared field manual. Some tried to politicize what had happened. Others tried to bury it again under layers of bureaucracy. But they were too late. The story had taken root in the hearts of those who mattered, on bases, in field hospitals, among engineers, medics, and mechanics who had always been the backbone but never the face of military lore. The lesson resonated far beyond Altair, that true strength does not announce itself with rank or uniform, and that leadership is not a title but a choice made moment by moment, in pressure and pain. The recruits who had once mocked Doc's tattoo now wore its likeness in silence, not as a trend, but as a reminder. They had seen what hidden strength looked like. They had seen how easy it was to misjudge someone based on grease-streaked clothes or quiet demeanor. They had witnessed a woman who'd never once raised her voice, yet commanded more respect than the loudest man in the room. And they had learned a truth so often forgotten in rigid systems, that competence has no single face. One evening, as the sun sank low and bathed the hangars in gold, Doc stood at the edge of the tarmac watching a group of recruits practicing vehicle extractions. Morales stood beside her, a clipboard in hand, but eyes on the horizon. Grayson was giving a debrief nearby, his voice steady and confident. And for the first time in a long time, there was no shadow over her thoughts, no weight of secrecy on her shoulders. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was home. The final moment came not with a ceremony, but a quiet nod. The base commander, once cold and dismissive, approached her during a late-night maintenance check. He didn't say much, just offered his hand, looked him in the eyes, and said that he had been wrong, that he was sorry, that he had learned more from her than from a decade of field reports. She didn't respond with bitterness or a list of his failures. She simply shook his hand, nodded once, and went back to work. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. Because the fight was no longer for recognition, but for those who would come after. And so the woman once mocked for her tattoo, once dismissed as a grease monkey in a man's uniform, had become something far greater. She had become the standard by which others measured themselves, not through noise, but through quiet courage. Not through power, but through presence. The kind of presence that doesn't fade with headlines or hype. The kind that endures. She had gone from forgotten medic to legendary mentor, and in the echo of her steps across that hangar floor, a new generation marched forward, never again assuming they knew who someone was by looking at them, never again mistaking silence for weakness, never again dismissing a tattoo without asking what it meant. They had learned. She had endured, and the system, however slowly, had begun to transform, one truth at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.